The air in the proving grounds tasted like copper and wet ash. Dean was supposed to be a stain on the gravel by now. The Coalition's training program didn't do dropouts, they did live bait tossed into the breeding pit of the galaxy's most lethal apex predators. He didn't pull a weapon, he didn't run, he just sat in the mud, snapped a nutrient bar in half, and sighed. Turns out terrifying alien death. Machines are sometimes just giant, misunderstood, heavily armored dogs. The impact knocked the breath from Dean's lungs in a harsh, ragged wheeze. He hit the ground hard, his left shoulder taking the brunt of the fall, against an unforgiving surface that felt like half-dried concrete and smelled fiercely of sulfur. For a long moment he didn't move. He just lay there, cheek pressed against the damp grit, listening to the sickening ringing in his own ears and the heavy rhythmic thud of his heart. High above, a brilliant shock of white light bled through the rusted iron grating of the pit. Against the glare, the silhouette of Instructor Caldwell was a sharp, jagged cutout. Caldwell wasn't human, though. The translation matrix implanted behind Dean's ear had assigned the alien a distinctly terrestrial name and a growly, flat accent to match. Caldwell's actual vocalizations were a series of harsh clicks and low-frequency rumbles that vibrated right in the marrow of your bones. Right now, the translation matrix was feeding Dean the alien's mocking words in a voice that sounded like grinding stones. Failure is a contaminant, Cadet. Dean. Caldwell's voice drifted down, echoing off the slimy curved walls of the enclosure. The Coalition does not waste resources shipping contaminants back to their fragile home worlds. We recycle them. You will provide excellent caloric value for the Vanguard hounds. Dean squeezed his eyes shut, his shoulder throbbed, a hot, bright spike of pain radiating down to his elbow every time he tried to shift his weight. He didn't feel a surge of righteous indignation. He didn't feel a sudden heroic burst of adrenaline urging him to climb the walls and exact his revenge. He was just so entirely profoundly tired. For 6 months he had been subjected to the gravity-heavy, oxygen-thin hellscape of the Coalition Academy. He had eaten synthesized protein paste that tasted like wet cardboard. He had marched until the soles of his boots wore flat, and then marched some more until his feet bled inside them. He had endured the sneers of species that considered humanity a soft, fleshy joke. And for what? To miss a jump over a plasma trench by 3 in, tear a ligament, and get tossed into the garbage chute. The heavy iron grate above slammed shut with a finality that made the ground beneath him shudder. The brilliant white light abruptly shifted to a dim, bruised purple. Emergency lighting. The feeding cycle had begun. Dean slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, hissing as his shoulder ground in its socket. His Coalition issue fatigue jacket was torn at the elbow, the fabric stiff with mud and his own sweat. He patted his pockets out of sheer muscle memory, though he already knew what he had. No sidearm, no combat knife, just a half-crushed foil packet containing a synthetic peanut butter ration and a broken glow stick that barely emitted a sickly green halo. Right, Dean muttered to the empty, echoing pit. Dinner time. He dragged himself backward, his boots scraping against the uneven floor until his spine hit the damp, curved wall of the pit. The stone was freezing, seeping through his thin shirt and raising goosebumps on his arms. He drew his knees up to his chest, resting his good arm across them. Air down here was thick, it felt heavy. In his lungs, saturated with the smell of old rust, ammonia snorts in. Something deeper, something organic and rotting. It smelled like a butcher shop, left to bake in the August sun. Somewhere in the darkness across the pit, a heavy mechanism groaned, snorts. It was the sound of gears grinding against decades of grime, snorts, followed by the deep hollow thud of a reinforced door sliding along a track. They were in. Dean let his head thump. Back against the wall, he stared into the purple gloom. He didn't bother trying to stand. What was the point? The Vanguard hounds were the Coalition's premier terror. Weapon, biologically engineered or selectively bred, Dean couldn't remember which, and didn't particularly care anymore. They were deployed to break sieges. They were fast, heavily armored, and entirely devoid of anything resembling mercy. A fully armed squad of Coalition regulars usually took casualties. Bringing one down, Dean had a bruised shoulder and a peanut butter bar. A low, vibrating growl rumbled through the floorboards. It wasn't a sound you heard, it was a sound you felt in your teeth. He stared into the shadows. The purple emergency lights offered almost zero contrast, turning the cavernous pit into a murky soup. But he could hear them, the soft, rhythmic click of heavy claws against stone. Click, clack, click. It wasn't rushed, it was deliberate. They knew there was nowhere for the meat to go. I should be screaming, Dean thought. I should be crying or praying, or trying to dig my way through solid rock. But the exhaustion was a heavy blanket, weighing down his panic. He remembered working the night shift at a gas station outside Omaha years ago. The bone-deep weariness of standing under flickering fluorescent lights at 3:00 in the morning, watching stray dogs pick through the dumpsters. He remembered tossing them expired hot dogs just to watch them eat. Another growl closer this time. The smell hit him then, a wave of hot, humid air, carrying the distinct scent of raw copper and feral musk. It was suffocating. From the ink-black shadows directly across from him, a shape began to detach itself. It was massive, easily the size of a small utility vehicle. Snorts, its shoulders hunched and rolling with a heavy muscular grace. Dim purple light caught the edges of jagged chitinous plating running down its spine. Dean didn't shrink back. He just watched the shadow step into the faint perimeter of light. Come on then, Dean whispered, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of bravado. Let's get this over with. The beast stepped fully into the dim purple light, and Dean's breath hitched. Despite his exhausted resignation, it was horrifying. Calling it a hound was a gross understatement, engineered by some bureaucrat who had never seen one breathe. It possessed 6 limbs, 4 thick, heavily muscled legs built for explosive acceleration, and 2 smaller, articulated forelimbs tucked near its chest, ending in vicious scythe-like claws. Its head was a wedge of thick, scarred armor plating, devoid of visible eyes, relying instead on a crown of fleshy, twitching sensory pits that flared and contracted with every breath. Its jaw was a nightmare of overlapping, serrated mandibles that clicked together with a sound like sharpening knives. Behind it, 2 more shapes detached from the darkness, slightly smaller but no less lethal. A pack, the lead hound. Dean immediately dubbed him Duke for the sheer imposing bulk of the thing. Lowered its wedge-shaped head. Sensory pits flared wide, taking Dean sent. It let out a huff of air. That ruffled Dean's sweat-soaked hair. The breath was hot, smelling sharply of sulfur and old blood. Duke took a slow, deliberate step forward, the claws on. Its heavy feet clicked loudly against the stone floor. Click-clack, Dean felt a sudden, involuntary tremor in his right hand. The primal lizard part of his brain was screaming at him to scramble up the wall, to run, to fight, to do anything other than sit paralyzed in the dirt. But his logical brain, coated in a thick layer of fatigue, held him down. Any sudden movement would trigger their prey drive. If he ran, he'd die tired. If he fought, he'd die in agony. So he sat perfectly still. He let his muscles go completely slack, slumping against the cold, wet wall. His snorts kept his breathing slow and shallow, forcing his heart rate down. Through sheer stubborn willpower, Duke stopped a mere 3 ft away. Up close, the creature wasn't just terrifying, it was a ruin of battle scars. The thick grayish hide between its armor plates was crisscrossed with old jagged burns and deep gouges. One of its smaller forelimbs hung slightly askew, the joint swollen and weeping a clear viscous fluid. Dean frowned, his eyes tracked from the swollen joint up to the creature's massive armored flank. Underneath the terrifying exterior, Dean recognized something deeply familiar in the way the beast held itself. It wasn't the proud, confident stance of a predator on the hunt. The shoulders were hunched too tightly, the weight was distributed unevenly, favoring the injured side. It was the stance of an animal that had been beaten into compliance, an animal that expected pain. The two subordinate hounds flanked Duke, their mandibles clicking rapidly in agitation. They wanted to tear into the meat, but they wouldn't move until the alpha gave the signal. Duke leaned in closer. The sensory pits along its skull rippled, almost touching Dean's face. The heat radiating off the beast was intense. Dean slowly, agonizingly slowly moved his uninjured right hand. The two smaller hounds hissed, their bodies tensing, ready to spring. Duke let out a low, warning rumble, sound that vibrated right through Dean's ribs, but the alpha didn't attack. It just watched the movement with its sensory pits tracking the slow, deliberate trajectory of Dean's hand as it reached into his torn pocket. Dean's fingers brushed the crinkled foil of the synthetic peanut butter ration. He pulled it out. The foil caught the dim purple light. Duke flinched. It was a minuscule movement, a sudden jerking back of the head, but Dean saw it. The beast thought he had drawn a weapon. A shock baton maybe, or a stun prod. Easy, Dean murmured. His voice sounded paper thin in the massive cavern. Just easy, big guy. Nobody's getting shocked. Today, he kept his movements exaggeratedly slow. He bit the top of the foil wrapper and tore it open. The sharp artificial smell of roasted peanuts and sugar flooded the heavy air, cutting through the stench of ammonia and sulfur like a knife. Instantly, snorts, the clicking of the mandibles stopped. All three hounds froze. Their sensory pits flared wildly, aiming directly at the small brown brick of paste in Dean's hand. They were starving. Dean realized it with a sudden, sharp clarity. The coalition didn't feed them before dropping prey into the pit. They kept them hungry. They kept them mean. Dean snapped the dense protein bar in half. His injured shoulder screamed in protest as he gently tossed one half onto the ground right between Duke's massive front paws. The chunk of food hit the wet stone with a soft thud, For 10 agonizing seconds. Nothing happened. The hounds stared at the food. Dean stared at the hounds. Then Duke shifted, the massive head lowered, hovering inches over the ration. The mandibles parted, revealing rows of inward curving teeth, and with a surprisingly delicate flick of a thick gray tongue, the alpha scooped the ration off the floor. It didn't chew, it just swallowed it whole. Duke raised its head again. Sensory pits focused on Dean's face, then flicked down to the remaining half of the ration in Dean's hand. The aggressive hunch posture had relaxed just a fraction. The low, vibrating growl had ceased. Dean let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. A bitter, disbelieving laugh bubbled up in his throat, echoing strangely in the grim silence of the pit. He looked up at the grated ceiling where Caldwell was likely watching the feed, waiting for the blood to start pooling. "You cheap bastards," Dean whispered to the ceiling. "You don't even feed your own dogs." He looked back at Duke. Massive alien predator was still watching his hand, looking less like a nightmare of galactic warfare and more like a stray moot begging for scraps behind a diner. Dean broke the remaining half of the ration into 2 smaller pieces. He tossed one to the left towards the smaller hound and one to the right. Both subordinate beasts snapped the food out of the air before it even hit the ground. Duke let out a short, sharp huff. It wasn't a growl, it was an expectation. The alpha stepped closer, the massive, armored wedge of its head lowering until it was level with Dean's chest. The beast didn't open its jaws, it simply pushed its heavy scarred snout against Dean's uninjured arm, nearly snorts knocking him over with the sheer force of the nudge. More, the gesture clearly demanded. Dean rested his head against the cold wall and smiled, a genuine exhausted smile. "Sorry, Duke," he said, holding up his empty hands. "That's all I've got. You'll have to eat me if you're still hungry." Duke snorted. A blast of hot, foul air washing over Dean's face. The beast turned in a tight circle, its heavy claws clicking against the stone, and then with a heavy sigh that sounded remarkably human, the massive apex predator collapsed onto the cold floor right next to Dean, the thick, armored bulk of its body pressed warmly against Dean's side, radiating heat into the freezing dampness of the pit. The 2 smaller hounds, seeing their alpha settle, trotted over and dropped heavily onto the ground nearby, forming a loose semicircle around the human. Dean sat there in the purple gloom, wedged between the wet wall and 1,000 pounds of lethal alien muscle. He reached out with his right hand and tentatively rested it on the thick, rough hide of Duke's shoulder. The beast didn't flinch. It just let out another long, rumbling breath and closed its heavy jaw. Up in the observation deck, Instructor Caldwell was going to have a very confusing afternoon. Time lost its architecture in the pit. Without a sun to track or a clock to watch, minutes stretched into an amorphous, bruised purple haze. Dean drifted in and out of a shallow, feverish doze. His left shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm that said perfectly with his heartbeat. The cold dampness of the stone walls seeped through his torn jacket, settling deep in his lower back, but his right side was burning. Duke radiated heat like an open blast furnace. The massive creature's breathing was a slow, mechanical wheeze that gently lifted and dropped its heavily armored ribcage against Dean's ribs. It smelled intensely of raw ozone and Wet soil, a harsh scent that completely overpowered the stagnant stench of the arena. Every so often, the beast would twitch. In its sleep, its heavy scythe-like forelimbs scraping uselessly against the stone, snorts dreaming of whatever nightmares apex predators had. Across the small span of the floor, the two smaller hounds Dean had mentally dubbed them Scrap and Patch, noting the missing chunk of armor on one and the jagged, mottled scar tissue on the other, were curled into tight defensive balls. They snored. It was a wet clicking sound like a loose fan belt in an old engine. Dean kept his eyes half open, staring at the ceiling grate. His mouth tasted like pennies and old adrenaline. He felt ridiculously small. He also felt, for the first time in 6 months, entirely ignored by the universe. The Coalition wanted him dead. The universe didn't care, and the monsters just wanted a nap. It was the most peaceful he'd felt since he enlisted. A sharp metallic screech shattered the quiet. Dean flinched, his right hand instinctively curling into a fist. Duke awoke instantly. The beast didn't scramble or stretch. It simply snapped from deep sleep to total rigid alertness. The sensory pits along its wedge-shaped skull flared wide, raw and red in the dim light. A low bone-rattling vibration started deep in its chest. Scrap and Patch were on their feet a second later, their mandibles clacking in rapid, agitated bursts. High above the heavy iron grating groaned and slid back on its rusted tracks. Brilliant, unfiltered white light poured down like a physical weight. Dean squinted, throwing his good arm over his eyes, his retinas burning. He heard the harsh, grinding clicks of Caldwell's native language echoing through the PA system. Immediately, snorts, followed by the flat, growly translation matrix in his ear. Maintenance crew, deploy the incinerator drones, clear the organic refuse, and prepare the enclosure. For Caldwell's translated voice cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the humming of the overhead flood lights. Dean slowly lowered his arm. He couldn't see Caldwell through the glare, but he could feel the sudden static tension radiating from the observation deck. "I'm not refused yet," Dean called out. His voice was horsaro, cracking on the last word. "Snorts, though I could use a fresh uniform." A different sound echoed from above, the whine of heavy repulsor engines. A square section of the wall adjacent to the pit began to lower, revealing a heavy transport lift descending slowly into the arena. On it stood 4 Coalition security officers. They wore fully sealed matte black impact armor. In their hands they held heavy triple-barreled shock rifles, the coils already glowing with a lethal electric blue charge. Duke stepped forward. The Alpha Hound placed itself directly between Dean and the descending lift. It didn't roar. It dropped its heavy head low to the ground, its powerful hind legs coiling tight. The thick armor plates along its spine lifted, exposing the softer, darker tissue underneath. A threat display. Scrap and Patch flanked him, matching the aggressive posture. "Cadet Dean." Caldwell's voice crackled over the PA. Stripped of its usual mocking tone, it sounded tightly coiled. "Step away from the vanguard units." Slowly, Dean looked at the glowing muzzles of the shock rifles. 4 heavily armed guards, twitchy and terrified, facing down 3 hungry, stressed predators. If someone pulled a trigger, the enclosed pit would turn into a meat grinder. The hounds would tear the Guards apart, but not before the rifles. Cooked everyone alive, Dean included. They're guarding their territory. Caldwell, Dean yelled back, not moving. An inch. His shoulder screamed as he braced himself against the wall. You. Drop 4 guys with charged rifles down. Here, they're going to defend it. They are feral biological weapons. Cadet, they do not have territory, they have targets. Step away. The lift hit the floor of the arena with a heavy metallic clang. The guards raised their rifles, the blue hum intensifying until it set Dean's teeth. On edge, Duke let out a deafening roar. It was a sound that defied description. A mixture of twisting metal and a screeching train car. The beast lunged forward a single pace, claws gouging deep trenches into the stone floor. Hold your fire, Dean screamed. He didn't think, he just moved. He shoved himself off the wall, his vision swimming with gray spots as his shoulder flared and stumbled forward, grabbing a fistful of the thick, coarse hide on the back of Duke's neck. The guards flinched, fingers tightening on the triggers. Duke, hey, stop. Dean pulled hard on the hide, throwing his meager weight backward. It was like trying to hold back a dump truck with a shoelace. But the beast froze. Duke snapped its massive head around, the mandibles clicking aggressively, the sensory pits flaring wildly as they took in Dean. Alien was breathing hard, hot gusts of sulfur washing over Dean's face. Dean didn't let go. He kept his grip tight, ignoring the screaming pain in his left side, and forced himself to exhale a long, slow breath. Easy, Dean muttered, keeping his voice low and steady, just like he had with the peanut butter ration. He patted the thick, scarred armor plating. Easy, big guy, just stand down. They aren't worth it. Duke rumbled, a deep, agitated sound, but the Alpha didn't lunge again. It shifted its weight backward, breaking the aggressive posture, though it kept its eyeless face trained dead on the security team. Seeing their Alpha relent, scrap and patch stopped clicking and backed up, their bodies still tense. Dean looked past the massive alien shoulder at the guards. They were frozen in place, their shock rifles trembling slightly. Lower the damn guns, Dean gasped, his legs suddenly feeling like wet paper. Unless you want to clean up the mess. No one moved. Up in the observation deck, Caldwell remained completely silent. Snorts. Dean leaned heavily against Duke's flank, his good hand still tangled in the coarse hide, and waited for the universe to decide if he got to live another 10 minutes. The medbay smelled like bleach and crushed mint, a harsh synthetic cocktail that burned the inside of Dean's nose. It was entirely too bright. The overhead surgical lights were a sterile, shadowless white that made his eyes water every time he tried to keep them open for more than a few seconds. He was sitting on a cold stainless steel examination table. His torn fatigue jacket was gone, tossed into a biohazard bin by a silent, multi-limbed medical droid that moved with unsettling efficiency. Now he wore a thin, paper-like gown that offered zero warmth. Brace, the droid chirped in a pleasant, synthetic soprano. Dean barely had time to grip the edge of the table with his right hand before the droid's mechanical manipulators clamped down on his left shoulder. There was a sharp, sickening pop, followed by a white-hot flash of agony that arched all the way up his neck and down into his fingertips. Dean choked on a scream, his vision blacking out for a split second. He slumped forward, gasping for air. Cold Sweat instantly beading on his forehead. Ligament realigned, micro-fractures. Sealed, applying dermal patch the droid. Announced cheerfully. A cold, numbing gel was slapped over his bruised skin, followed by a tight, rigid bandage that locked his shoulder into place. Thanks, Dean wheezed, spitting the metallic taste of pain out of his mouth. You've got a terrible bedside manner. The heavy sliding doors of the medbay hissed open. Instructor Caldwell stepped inside. The alien looked distinctly uncomfortable in the pristine, brightly lit room. Without the shadows of the proving grounds, Caldwell's features were fully visible, pale segmented skin stretched tight over a rigid exoskeleton, with multiple sets of compound eyes that clicked independently. Behind Caldwell stepped a human. Dean blinked away the lingering tears of pain. The man wore the crisp dark gray uniform of Coalition intelligence. No rank insignia, no name tag, just perfectly tailored suit that cost more than Dean's entire hometown. His hair was heavily salted with gray, cut with military precision, and his eyes were the flat, unreadable color of wet slate. Cadet Dean, the man said. His voice was quiet, lacking the booming authority Dean usually heard from the brass. It was the voice of a man who never had to repeat himself. I am Director Miller. You've had a highly irregular morning. Dean carefully sat up straight, his left arm immobilized against his chest. Yes, sir. Usually I just get yelled at before lunch. Today was a nice change of pace. Caldwell's mandibles clicked rapidly in irritation, a sound the translation matrix helpfully filtered out. Director Miller didn't smile, but a tiny crease appeared at the corner of his eye. Instructor Caldwell informs me that you failed the plasma trench jump, Miller said, clasping his hands behind his back. And per protocol for terminal failures, you were deposited into the Vanguard enclosure. I was thrown into a pit of starving monsters. Yeah, Dean corrected, his voice flat. He was too tired for military decorum. Is there a form I need to sign to get my things back, or am I headed to the brig for surviving? Miller walked slowly toward the examination table. He looked Dean up and down, his gaze lingering on the heavy medical bracing on Dean's shoulder. The Vanguard hounds are an engineered species, Dean, Miller said, his tone conversational. Bred from the apex predators of the Kalara system, they are incredibly resilient, brutally efficient, and notoriously unstable. We snorts lose on average a dozen handlers a year just trying to move them between transport shuttles. They do not bond, they do not socialize, they kill. And they eat. Miller stopped at the foot of the table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flat data pad. He tapped the screen and held it up for Dean to see. It was security footage from the pit. Dean watched the grainy purple-tinted video of himself looking pathetic and small, breaking a peanut butter ration in half and tossing it to the massive, heavily armored Alpha. He watched the beast swallow it, then step forward and press its heavy snout against Dean's chest. You fed it, Caldwell rasped, his translated voice thick with disgust. You offered sustenance to a biological weapon. It was hungry, Dean said, looking away from the screen. You keep them down in the dark. You starve them, and you wonder why they want to rip your arms off every time you open the door. They aren't machines, Caldwell. They're just angry dogs. They are not dogs, Caldwell snapped, stepping forward, his exoskeleton clicking. aggressively. They are class as siege breakers, and you have contaminated their kill drive with your mammalian sentimentality. Enough, Miller said softly. The word wasn't loud, but Caldwell instantly stepped back, his compound eyes lowering. Miller turned his attention back to Dean. Currently, the 3 units in that pit are refusing to allow the automated feeders to attach. They have destroyed 2 cleaning drones. They are agitated, aggressive, and highly volatile. Miller paused, tilting his head slightly. Except when we broadcast your vocal audio through the PA system. Then they sit down and wait by the grated door. Dean frowned, processing the information, the dull throbbing in his shoulder suddenly felt very far away. He looked at the intelligence director. What do you want, Miller? Dean asked. Dropping the sir. The coalition doesn't waste resources, Dean. We recycle them, Miller said, echoing Caldwell's earlier words, but the context had entirely shifted. You failed out of the standard infantry track. You are by all metrics a substandard soldier. You lack the agility for recon, the strength for heavy weapons, and the discipline for command. Miller put the data pad back into his pocket. However, the director continued, you have somehow bypassed the hyperaggressive neural pathways of our most lethal siege weapons using a cracked rib and half a nutrient bar. The Vanguard program costs the coalition 3 billion credits annually, and we can barely point them in the right direction without losing a platoon. Dean felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He suddenly wished he was back in the damp, freezing pit. I'm not a handler, Dean said, his voice tightening. I don't know the first thing about alien biology. You don't need to know their biology. You just need to hold the leash, Miller said. He gestured to the medical droid. Get him dressed, standard handler. Fatigues. Class 4 body armor. Wait, hold on. Dean swung his legs off the table, wincing as his shoulder pulled. You're sending me back in there with them? Miller turned toward the door, Caldwell falling into step behind him. The director paused at the threshold and looked back over his shoulder. The flat, slate-gray eyes were devoid of any warmth. Not just in there, handler Dean. We are currently engaged in a brutal urban pacification on Sector 4. High casualties. The enemy is entrenched in a subterranean network. Miller adjusted his cuffs. You deploy in 3 hours. Get acquainted with your squad. I suggest you bring more peanut butter. The Class 4 handler armor didn't fit. It was designed for someone with a chest like a barrel and arms thick enough to wrestle a transport vehicle, not a washed-out infantry cadet running on 3 hours of sleep and synthetic adrenaline. It hung heavy on Dean's frame, pulling aggressively at his newly patched left shoulder. The rigid composite plating smelled intensely of industrial solvent and cold, vulcanized rubber. Every time he took a breath, the internal atmospheric seal hissed. Tiny, annoying reminder of his own fragility. He stood in the cavernous expanse of Staging Bay 7. Around him, the organized chaos of a coalition. Deployment was in full swing. Heavily armed platoons of mixed species rushed past, boots slamming against the grated deck, shouting over the deafening cyclical whine of the dropship engines. Warming up, the air was a thick soup of exhaust fumes, stale sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of weapons-grade ozone. Dean felt entirely invisible right up until he approached the Vanguard containment zone. It was a cordoned-off section at the far end of the bay, flanked by reinforced barricades and manned by a dozen heavily armed security personnel. As Dean walked toward them, the noise of the surrounding staging bay seemed to drop an octave. The regular infantry gave the area wide berth, their eyes flicking nervously toward the heavy blast-proof holding pen. A tech officer, a lanky human with a clipboard and a distinctly terrified expression, stepped up to Dean. He shoved a heavy matte black control module into Dean's good hand. It was covered in toggle switches and a prominent red dial. Pain compliance matrix, the tech shouted over the ambient roar, pointing at the dial. Channel 1 is the alpha, 2 and 3 are the subordinates. Keep your thumb on the master override. If they turn on you crank it to maximum and burn their nervous systems out before they can bite through your helmet. Dean looked down at the heavy plastic brick. It felt dirty in his hand. He remembered the swollen, weeping joint on Duke's forelimb. He remembered the flinch. Take it back, Dean said, shoving the module back against the tech's chest. The tech blinked, stumbling backward a step. Cadet, that's your primary control. I said take it back. I don't know how to use it, and I'm not going to learn right now. Dean turned away before the tech could argue, walking directly toward the blast doors of the holding pen. He keyed the comms on his helmet. Open it up. Security guards exchanged panicked looks. One of them tapped his earpiece, likely confirming the insane order with Intelligence Director Miller, who was watching from a gantry high above. A second later, the heavy hydraulic locks disengaged with a sound like a rifle crack. The steel doors slid apart. The stench hit Dean instantly. It was the same feral musk from the pit, concentrated in the small metal room, but now spiked with the sour, acrid scent of extreme stress. The three hounds were pacing frantically. Scrap and Patch were throwing their armored bodies against the reinforced walls, their claws tearing long, ragged strips of metal from the paneling. In the center, Duke stood rigid, his head low. Sensory pits flared wide, trembling with a contained explosive violence. They were terrified. The noise, the vibrations of the ship, the cramped space. It was a sensory overload driving them into a frenzy. Dean stepped inside. The heavy doors hissed shut behind him, cutting off the noise of the staging bay. Instantly, all three beasts snapped their attention to him. The mandibles clicked in a deafening crescendo. Scrap lunged forward, stopping just short of Dean's chest. A low, rumbling hiss vibrating the deck plates. Dean didn't raise his hands. He didn't tense his muscles. He let out a long, heavy sigh, letting his shoulders slump under the excessive weight of the armor. He took off his helmet with his right hand, dropping it onto the floor with a dull clatter, exposing his face to the foul, humid air. Yeah, I know, Dean said softly. His voice sounded pathetic in the echo chamber of the pen. It sucks, it's loud, it stinks, and nobody wants to be here. Duke pushed past the smaller hound. The massive alpha stepped into Dean's personal space. The eyeless armored wedge of a head lowered, the sensory pits rippling wildly as they mapped the contours of Dean's face, pulling in his scent beneath the industrial rubber of the armor. The beast let out a sharp huff, a burst of hot air that plastered Dean's sweat soaked hair to his forehead. Dean reached into the heavy utility pouch. Strapped to his thigh, he pulled out a large industrial-sized jar of synthetic peanut butter he had strong-armed from the mess hall quartermaster 20 minutes ago. He unscrewed the lid. The frenzied clicking stopped. Duke's head snapped down to the jar. The massive jaws parted. Dean didn't flinch as the thick gray tongue slithered out, scooping a massive glob of the dense paste directly from the plastic container. Duke swallowed, letting out a deep chest, rattling rumble that sounded dangerously close to a purr. "Easy, big guy," Dean murmured, letting Scrap and Patch crowd in to get their share. He rested his right hand heavily on the thick scarred armor of Duke's neck, feeling the coarse hide beneath his fingers. "Just stick with me. We're going to take a really awful ride, and then we're going to go for a walk." The floor beneath them shuddered violently. The dropship was detaching from the staging bay. Dean sat down heavily on the deck, leaning his back against the cold steel wall. Duke circled once, claws scraping loudly, before collapsing beside him, resting his massive, heavy head across Dean's armored thighs. Scrap and Patch settled against his sides, effectively burying the human, a mountain of lethal vibrating muscle. Dean closed his eyes, listening to the muffled roar of the atmospheric thrusters engaging. He was plunging into a war zone with zero combat training, guided by 3 feral alien predators. He tasted the peanut butter lingering in the humid air, and for the first time all day he didn't feel completely alone. Sector 4 wasn't a battlefield, it was a grave being dug in real time. The dropship slammed into the ground with a bone-jarring impact that threw Dean hard against Duke's armored flank. Outside, the world was a cacophony of tearing metal and rolling thunder. The subterranean network of the sector was a massive, sprawling labyrinth of concrete transit tunnels, industrial refineries, and dark, claustrophobic maintenance shafts. It was a place designed for machines, currently occupied by terrified dying people. The heavy boarding ramp dropped with a screech of tortured hydraulics. Dim, flickering emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across the dust choked air. Concrete dust was everywhere, a fine chalky powder that coated the back of the throat, and snorts tasted sharply of alkaline and dried blood. "Handler unit, move out," the dropship pilot screamed over the intercom, the voice cracking with static and panic. "We are taking fire. Clear the ramp." Dean grabbed his helmet, shoving it over his head. The internal HUD flickered too, life bathing his vision in a pale green overlay. He didn't have a weapon. They hadn't issued him one. You don't give the dog Walker a rifle, you just tell him to unzip the leash. "Come on," Dean yelled, slapping Duke's shoulder. The hounds didn't need to be told twice. The instant the ramp hit the ground, their predatory instincts overrode their fear of the transport. They surged forward, a terrifying blur of chitinous armor and rippling muscle. Dean scrambled after them, his boots slipping on the rubble-strewn concrete. As he ran down the ramp and into the gloom of the tunnel, the noise was absolute. Somewhere in the dark ahead, heavy plasma artillery was chewing through reinforced bulkhead. Every detonation sent a physical shock wave rolling down the corridor, rattling Dean's teeth in his skull. The air was baking hot, suffocatingly thick with the smell of vaporized plasteel and chemical fires. 50 yards down the primary transit artery, Dean found the remnants of the Coalition infantry unit they were. Supposed to relieve, they were pinned down behind the shattered remains of a transport train, searing bolts of purple. Plasma whipped over their heads, melting deep, glowing craters into the concrete. Walls behind them. The enemy, a local insurrectionist faction heavily entrenched in the maintenance tunnels, had set up overlapping fields of fire from two elevated pillboxes further down the tunnel. It was a meat grinder. Anyone stepping out from behind the train was instantly vaporized. A coalition sergeant, his armor scorched black and half his visor blown away, grabbed Dean by the shoulder plate and yanked him down into the dirt behind the train's rusted wheels. "Where the hell is your weapon, cadet?" The sergeant roared over the deafening crack of a plasma bolt impacting a foot above their heads. He stared wildly at Dean's empty hands. "Where's the handler remote?" Dean didn't answer. He was staring at the hounds. Duke, Scrap, and Patch hadn't taken cover. They stood in the center of the tunnel, bathed in the strobe light flashes of incoming plasma fire. The heavy bolts were impacting against their thick biological armor, splashing off the kitten in harmless showers of sparks. The heat was immense, but the hounds barely flinched. They were built for this. They were siege breakers, but they weren't attacking. They were pacing, their sensory pits flaring, heads snapping toward the elevated pillboxes. Then back to Dean. They were waiting for the agonizing jolt of the pain. Compliance collar to tell them who to kill. They were waiting to be punished. Into action. Dean pushed himself up onto his knees. His left shoulder screamed, a hot knife twisting in the socket, but he ignored it. He locked eyes with the sensory pits on Duke's massive scarred head. He didn't have a remote. He just had the memory of a tired dog at a gas station and the heavy weight of a peanut butter jar in his thigh pouch. Dean pointed a single trembling, armored finger down the tunnel directly at the left pillbox. "Duke!" Dean screamed, his voice tearing his throat raw, stripping away the military protocols, the handler training he never had, and the paralyzing fear of the tunnel. He didn't sound like a coalition soldier. He sounded like a guy backing up his friends in a bar fight. "Get him!" Duke didn't hesitate. The massive beast unleashed a roar that completely drowned out the artillery fire, a snort sound so deep and resonant it cracked the remaining glass in the transport train. Duke hit the ground, massive hind legs exploding with terrifying kinetic force. The Alpha cleared 30 FT in a single bound, snorts launching itself off the wall and hurtling toward the left pillbox like a freight train made of razors. Scrap and Patch followed instantly. Synchronized wave of violence tearing down the right flank. The sergeant beside Dean stopped firing. He just stared, his mouth hanging open behind his shattered visor. There was no grace to it. It was brutal, terrifying. Physics. Duke slammed into the reinforced plastel of the pillbox. The metal groaned and buckled under the sheer mass of the beast. Heavy scythe-like forelimbs blurred, tearing through the barricade as if it were wet cardboard. The screams that followed were short, sharp, and abruptly silenced by the sickening crunch of mandibles meeting bone. On the right, Scrap and Patch were a coordinated nightmare, flushing the insurrectionists out of their cover and running them down before they could even level their weapons. It wasn't a battle. It was pest control. Within 40 seconds, the deafening roar of incoming plasma fire stopped. The tunnel fell into a heavy ringing Silence broken only by the wet, tearing sounds echoing from the dark. Dean slumped back against the rusted wheel of the train, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His hands were shaking violently. He closed his eyes, the smell of burnt ozone and fresh slaughter heavy in his lungs. A heavy thud vibrated through the ground. Then a wet scraping sound. Dean opened his eyes. Duke was standing over him. The beast's mandibles were slick with dark fluid, the gray armor coated in a fine layer of concrete dust. The Alpha lowered its massive head, sensory pits twitching, and nudged Dean's armored chest with its scarred snout. It was a heavy, demanding push. Dean let out a weak, hysterical laugh. His hands trembled as he reached into his thigh pouch, pulling out the jar of peanut butter. Yeah, hold on. Dean wheezed, unscrewing the lid. Good boy. The Coalition infantry emerged from behind the shattered transport train, slowly like men waking from a collective nightmare. They kept their shock rifles raised, the blue coils humming, their helmet visors scanning the dark recesses of the tunnel. The air was still thick with the gray, chalky dust of pulverized concrete and the sickeningly sweet smell of vaporized organics. Sergeant Briggs, the name stenkled in faded white paint across his blackened chest plate, stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly over the debris. He stopped 10 ft from Dean, his eyes locked on the massive armored bulk of the Vanguard hounds. Scrap and Patch were busy pacing the perimeter of the destroyed pillboxes, their mandibles clicking as they nose through the rubble. Duke, however, was sitting squarely in front of Dean, diligently licking the last remnants of synthetic peanut butter from the plastic rim of the jar. You didn't use the module, Briggs stated. His voice was a flat, disbelieving rasp, filtered through his ruined helmet. He looked at Dean's empty hands, then down at the heavy black control matrix that was currently lying forgotten on the deck of the dropship miles above them. How did you trigger the kill command without the pain matrix there? Supposed to be hard locked to the collar frequencies. Dean carefully screwed the lid back onto the empty jar and shoved it into his thigh pouch. His left shoulder was an agonizing hot knot of tension. The medical droid's numbing gel had worn off entirely, leaving a deep throbbing ache that pulsed with his heartbeat. I didn't trigger a command, Dean said, tiredly, grabbing the edge of the train wheel with his good hand to pull himself up. Snorts. I just pointed. They did the rest. Briggs took a slow step back as Duke shifted his weight. The Alpha hound turned its eyeless, wedge-shaped head toward the sergeant. The sensory pits along its skull flared wide, pulling in the scent of human sweat, fear, and ozone. A low, rattling vibration started in Duke's chest, a warning sound that resonated in the stagnant air. Hey. No, Dean snapped, stepping between the sergeant and the massive alien predator. He rested his right hand on the coarse, scarred hide of Duke's neck. Stand down, we're on the same side. Duke let out a sharp huff of air, blowing a cloud of concrete dust off Briggs's boots, but the deep rumbling stopped. The beast nudged Dean's hip, effectively pushing the human slightly backward, placing its armored bulk marginally closer to the heavily armed infantry. Man, it was a subtle protective gesture. It made Dean's chest tighten with a strange, uncomfortable knot of guilt. Command wants us pushing to the central refinery manifold, Briggs said, his eyes never leaving Duke's mandibles. He tapped the side of his ruined helmet. listening to a faint radio transmission. Intel says the insurrectionists have fortified the primary water reclamation pumps if they detonate the charges. There, this whole subterranean sector. Floods, we drown in the dark, Dean. Looked down the tunnel, beyond the destroyed pillboxes, the transit artery. Descended at a steep angle, plunging into a pitch-black expanse where the emergency lighting had entirely failed. The air down there was colder, smelling of damp rot, rust, and stagnant water. It was the throat of the beast, all right, Dean muttered. He picked up a discarded shock rifle from the dirt. Checking the charge indicator, it was heavy, awkward in his one good hand. But he didn't want to walk into the dark completely unarmed. Let's go for a walk. The descent was miserable. The tunnel floor was slick, with a layer of industrial sludge and standing water that splashed sluggishly around their ankles. The coalition squad fell into a loose diamond formation, their heavy boots splashing loudly. Dean walked point directly behind the three hounds. The beasts moved differently in the dark without the frenzied constraints of the holding pen or the chaotic noise of the staging bay. They were eerily silent. Their heavy side-like claws retracted slightly, leaving only the soft padded thud of their massive paws. Their sensory pits rippled continuously in the gloom, mapping the thermal and chemical landscape of the tunnel with terrifying precision. Dean watched Duke's armored spine roll with every fluid step. The contrast between the sheer, world-ending violence the creature had displayed 10 minutes ago and snorts, the calm, calculated way it navigated the dark was deeply unsettling. They weren't mindless eating machines. They were tacticians. Movement, Briggs hissed from behind his rifle snapping up. Dean froze. 50 yards ahead, the tunnel widened into a massive cavernous junction, thick iron pipes crusted with decades of mineral build-up crisscrossed the ceiling. The air was thick with a heavy, unnatural heat. Duke stopped dead. The Alpha dropped low to the ground, the armored plating along its spine flaring upward. Scrap and Patch instantly mirrored the movement, their bodies pressing flat against the wet, sludgy floor. The clicking of their mandibles was gone, replaced by total predatory silence. From the shadows of the junction, a harsh mechanical whine began to spool up. It didn't sound like plasma fire. It sounded like a massive industrial turbine spinning beyond its red line. Snorts, blinding, searing yellow light suddenly ignited, casting long, distorted shadows of the pipes against the wet walls. Heavy armor. Someone in the squad screamed. A repurposed mining crawler stepped into the junction. It was a towering quadruple monstrosity of riveted yellow steel, heavily modified, with thick sloped armor plating and twin rotary plasma cannons mounted on its central chassis. It was designed to bore through solid bedrock. It didn't care about biological weapons. The rotary cannon spun to a blur, and the tunnel erupted into white-hot hell. The noise was a physical blow that knocked Dean off his feet. He hit the sludgy ground hard, tasting stagnant water and old oil as a solid stream of blinding yellow plasma tore through the space he had just occupied. The air instantly superheated, searing the inside of his lungs. Back. Get back into the narrow section, Briggs roared over the deafening roar of the cannons. The coalition infantry scrambled backward, firing uselessly at the crawler. Their blue plasma bolts splashed against the sloped yellow armor. Without leaving a dent, Dean pressed his face into the muck, covering his helmet. With his good hand, the sheer volume of fire was suppressing the entire squad, chewing away the concrete walls and sending shrapnel raining down like deadly hail. He looked up through the smoke. The hounds hadn't retreated. Duke, Scrap, and Patch were violently zigzagging through the incoming fire, using their terrifying acceleration to close the distance. They were fast, but the tunnel offered no cover. A stray bolt caught Patch. The hind quarters, the smaller hound let out a piercing metallic shriek that sounded like tearing sheet metal, tumbling end over end into the shallow water. No, Dean's heart seized. He pushed himself up onto his knees, his hands slipping in the sludge. Scrap reached the crawler first, launching violently into the air. The beast's heavy claws sparked against the reinforced cockpit glass, searching for purchase, but the sloped armor offered none. The crawler's massive mechanical leg shifted, swatting Scrap out of the air. With a sickening, heavy thud, the hound crashed into the tunnel wall and didn't immediately get back up. Duke was directly underneath the machine now, tearing frantically at the heavy hydraulic lines protecting the crawler's underbelly, but the thick steel mesh held. The crawler's main turret began to pivot downward, the glowing barrels taking aim directly at the Alpha's exposed back. Duke was too large to maneuver underneath the chassis quickly enough to escape the angle. The machine was going to cut him in half. Dean didn't think. The cynical, survival-driven part of his brain screamed at him to stay in the mud. He was a washed-out cadet with a busted shoulder and no armor worth a damn. But his legs were already moving. He grabbed the heavy shock rifle from the muck, abandoning the useless sling. He sprinted forward out of the darkness and directly into the blinding yellow glare of the crawler's floodlights. The heat was unbearable, baking the sweat instantly off his skin. "Hey!" Dean screamed, his voice raw, throwing himself against the rusted base of a massive structural pipe. He didn't aim at the heavy armor. He aimed at the top of the crawler, where a cluster of glass-encased optical sensors glowed an angry red. He braced the heavy rifle against the pipe, squeezed his eyes shut against the recoil, and held the trigger down. The rifle kicked violently, tearing at his ruined left shoulder, but the blue plasma bolts sailed true. They smashed into the optical cluster, shattering the heavy glass and melting the delicate internal lenses. The crawler let out a harsh digitized squeal, blinded its targeting matrix through chaotic error. The massive main turret abruptly stopped its downward pivot, snapping upward to randomly rake the ceiling where the fire had originated. Heavy iron pipes burst open, raining a torrent of scalding rusty water down onto the metal chassis. Duke didn't waste the opening. With a deafening, bone-rattling roar, the Alpha hound surged upward from underneath the chassis, finding purchase on a damaged exhaust vent. Duke hauled his massive 1,000 lb bulk onto the side of the crawler. His thick scythe-like forelimbs didn't strike the armor. Instead, they plunged deep into the ruined optical cluster. Dean had just opened up, tearing past the melted glass and ripping straight into the machine's primary data conduit. Sparks showered like a violent firework display. Duke bit down hard into the exposed wiring, shaking his massive wedge-shaped head violently. The crawler shuddered, its mechanical legs spasming outward with a final dying whine of its rotary Cannons, the machine collapsed into the sludge, completely dead. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of rushing water from the ruptured overhead pipes and the heavy, ragged breathing of the hounds. Dean dropped the rifle. He slid down the curved side of the iron pipe until he was sitting in the cold sludge, his left arm completely numb, his chest heaving. He coughed, spitting a dark glob of soot and water onto the ground. Through the haze of steam and smoke, a massive shadow approached. Duke moved slowly, limping slightly on his left forg. The beast's armored face was scorched black, the sensory pits raw and inflamed. From the heat, he didn't ask for a treat. He didn't nudge Dean's chest. The Alpha simply lowered his heavy bulk down into the freezing water right next to Dean, pressing his massive heat radiating flank against the human's trembling shoulder. A moment later, Scrap and Patch limped over, both battered and bleeding clear fluid from shallow scorch marks, but alive. They curled up on Dean's right side, clicking softly in the gloom. Sergeant Briggs and the rest of the squad slowly walked up to the wreckage, their flashlights cutting through the steam. They looked at the dead multi-ton mining crawler and then at the exhausted cadet sitting in the mud, completely buried under 3 of the galaxy's most lethal biological weapons. "Cadet," Brig said softly, the fear in his voice replaced entirely by a quiet, profound respect. "Is your squad ready to move?" Dean let his head fall back against the cold iron pipe. He rested his right hand on Duke's heavily scarred neck, feeling the slow, steady thump of the beast massive heart. "Give us a minute," Sergeant Dean rasped, closing his eyes. "The dogs are tired." The walk to the primary water reclamation pumps took another 20 agonizing minutes of slogging through knee-deep freezing sludge. Dean's left arm was entirely useless, hanging limp at his side, a dead weight pulling down on his collarbone. He was running purely on the fumes of survival instinct and the snorts, residual heat radiating from the massive beasts flanking him. The central manifold wasn't just a room, it was a cathedral of industrial neglect, a massive cylindrical chamber plunging deep into the bedrock. It was dominated by 3 immense rotary pumps groaning against the weight of millions of gallons of stagnant subterranean water. The air here was 10 degrees colder, heavy with a mist that tasted of copper and raw chlorine. Sergeant Briggs held up a fist. The squad froze. There was no plasma fire, no shouting, just the echoing rhythmic thud of the turbines. The insurrectionists had vanished. "It's too quiet," Briggs whispered over the comms, his voice tight. "O'Connor, sweep for thermals." Private O'Connor raised a bulky scanner. "Nothing, Sarge. Ambient temperature is masking everything, just us and the pumps." "They wouldn't just abandon the objective," Briggs muttered, sweeping his rifle across the rusted catwalks. Duke let out a sharp, distressed whine. It was a sound violently out of place, coming from a creature that could tear a tank apart. The Alpha stepped in front of Dean, blocking his path toward the central control console. The sensory pits crowning its scarred skull flared erratically, rippling in a chaotic wave. Patch and Scrap mirrored the distress, backing away toward the tunnel entrance, claws clicking nervously against the steel grating. "What's wrong with the assets?" Briggs asked, stepping back. "I don't know," Dean rasped. He forced his heavy legs to move, stepping around Duke to look at the console. "Dean, stop," O'Connor hissed, his scanner suddenly screamed a high-pitched warning. Chemical signature spiking, Dean stopped. A foot away from the console, beneath the heavy iron wheel of the main pressure valve, sat a block of dull gray putty wired directly into the console's power feed. It was a crude, ugly explosive, enough to shatter the manifold and drown the entire sector. Jury-rigged thermoric charge, O'Connor. Breath pressure release trigger. If we turn the valve to shut down the water, it blows. If we try to cut the hard line, it blows. I need to find the bypass relay. O'Connor stepped forward. Reaching for his toolkit, Duke snapped his jaws. The sound cracked like a whip over the roaring pumps. The Alpha lunged, planting his massive front paws on the steel grating right in front of the console, his head sweeping back and forth. "Call him off, Dean," O'Connor shouted. "Freezing. If he bumps the console, he's..." "Not looking at the console," Dean said. Cold clarity hit him. Duke's sensory pits were focused downward, fixated on a small crevice beneath the grating. Beast was tracking a highly volatile center. O'Connor, look under the floor right, where his left paw is pointing. The tech swallowed hard, shining his helmet light through the heavy steel mesh. "Son of a bitch," O'Connor whispered. "Secondary trigger wire. Chemical trip line, thinner than fishing wire. If I had stepped forward, my boot would have snapped it." The silence that followed was heavier than the rushing water. Briggs slowly lowered his rifle. "Can you bypass it?" Dean asked, resting his good hand firmly on Duke's armored flank to keep the beast steady. "Yeah," O'Connor wiped sweat from his eyes. "Just give me 2 minutes and keep the dog still. He's the only one who knows what he's doing," Dean muttered. The extraction was a blur of blinking lights and shouted orders. By the time the dropship broke the atmospheric cloud cover, the harsh light of the system's pale sun bled through the troop bay windows. Dean sat on the cold deck of the transport. His armor was scored with burns and coated in dried sludge. His shoulder was a constant blinding throb. Duke's heavy armored head rested across his lap, the beast snoring softly. Scrap and Patch were curled tightly into the Alpha's sides, forming a massive sleeping pile of lethal muscle and scarred kitten. Director Miller was waiting on the tarmac when the ramp lowered at the staging bay. The intelligence director's pristine suit was a jarring contrast to the exhausted reality of the returning squad. 4 heavily armed guards flanked him. Miller looked at the ruined mining crawler data on his pad, then at Dean. "A highly unconventional success, handler," Dean Miller said, his voice flat. "You lost control of the assets, but they managed to secure the objective." "I didn't lose control," Dean said, stroking his thumb over the rough hide between Duke's closed sensory pits. "I never had it. You don't control them, Miller." "Be that as it may," Miller gestured to the guard. "Snorts, the operation is concluded. Secure the assets and return them to the holding pens." The guard stepped forward, raising heavy stun prods. Duke awoke instantly. The Alpha snapped its head up, mandibles parting in a silent display of inward curving teeth. A low, rumbling vibration started deep in its chest, making the guards freeze. Scrap and Patch rose, flanking Dean, bodies coiled and ready to spring. "Stand down," Miller ordered the guards, his voice wavering slightly. He looked at Dean. "Control your beasts." "Cadet, they aren't beasts," Dean said quietly. He pushed himself up, leaning heavily Against Duke's armored shoulder, the aliens supported the humans' weight, without hesitation. And they aren't going back in the dark. If you try to drag them, they'll tear you apart. Miller stared, weighing the cost of 3 billion credits of biological weaponry against the broken human standing in front of him. You are a very insubordinate soldier. Dean. I'm a washout, Dean corrected, a tired smile cracking his grime-covered face. I'm just a guy walking his dogs. Miller turned on his heel and walked away. The guards hastily followed. Dean stood on the ramp, the cold wind washing over him. He reached into his thigh pouch, fingers brushing the empty plastic jar. He'd have to raid the quartermaster again. The dogs were going to be hungry. And that's how a washed-out cadet turned the galaxy's most terrifying biological weapons into man's best friend. If you loved this gritty boots on the ground HFY story, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more epic sci-fi tales. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Got an idea for what Dean and his Vanguard hounds should face on their next deployment? Drop your ideas in the comments below and share this video with anyone who loves a true underdog story. Thanks for watching and see you in the next